Okay, hi everybody. This week we are going to talk about a lady that Jesus met. Now Jesus and his disciples were in Judea and he had been healing people and teaching people there. But then he said that they were going to go to a place called Galilee, and that was north, so they were going to have to take a trip. They were going to go for a long walk. And normally there was an area in Israel that the Jews didn't like to go. It was called Samaria. And that was the area that the Jews had really been intermarrying with the heathens of that area, and they some of them worshipped idols, and they didn't go to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. They had built a place to worship there in Samaria. And so the Jews, they didn't like the Samaritans. It's strange how groups of people dislike other groups of people, but that's the way it was. And normally Jews didn't want anything to do with the Samaritans, but Jesus said, when we go to Galilee, I want to go through Samaria. He said, I must needs go through Samaria. There was something he needed to do there. Well, I'm sure his disciples were wondering what that would be and why they had to go through Samaria. But Jesus did many things that were unusual. And so they were used to unusual things when they were with him. So they went through Samaria. Well, they got to a place called Jacob's Well. Now, you'll remember the first Israelite, the first Jew was Abraham. And then he had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob. So Jacob was the grandson of Abraham. And this well had actually been dug by Jacob, and his family had drunk from this well. And so the people in Samaria thought that this was a really special place. One of their special ancestors had this well. So when they got to the well, Jesus sat down to rest, and he sent his disciples off to find food. It was throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will find that they're always talking about, thinking about, looking for food, because we all have to eat. So off they went to get some food, but Jesus wasn't really interested in food. He had something to do. So he sat down at the well. They had been walking for a long time. He was tired. And along came a woman, a Samaritan woman, with her pot to get some water from the well. So obviously, that far back, they did not have running water. They didn't have a tap they could just turn on in their house and get some water. They had to walk outside of town to go to the well, or sometimes the well would be in the middle of the town. They would go to the well and draw the water up. It's a lot of work to pull water. I don't know if you've carried a heavy bucket of water, but it's heavy. And so the women would go, this was their job, they'd go and get the water and bring it home to do all the stuff that they needed the water for that day. And normally, the women would all go together, and it would be a social time. They would talk together and laugh together and draw their water together and help each other. But this woman came all by herself because the other women didn't like her very much. And you'll find out why later. So she came to the well by herself at noontime, a time of day that they wouldn't normally do this. It would have been very hot. You'd get tired more easily. And she went to get her water, and Jesus said, give me to drink. Now, this Samaritan woman knew right away when she looked at Jesus that he was a Jew. And she knew that the Jews didn't like the Samaritans, and it's probable the Samaritans didn't like the Jews either. And so she said, you're a Jew, why would you ask a Samaritan woman for a drink of water? You know that the Jews have nothing to do with the Samaritans. And Jesus said, if you knew the gift that I have for you and who I am, who it is that asks the water of you, then you would ask me for living water. Well, she did not understand this. She's just thinking about the water in the well. And she said, well, you don't have anything to put water in. You have no way to get the water out of the well. It's a very deep well. How will you get this living water that you say that you can give to me? Are you greater than our father Jacob? who made this well that we drink from? How can you give me better water than he could? Well, then Jesus started to talk to her about the difference between living water and the water that we would drink, the actual water that she was looking to get out of the well. He said, well, anyone who drinks of the water from this well will get thirsty again. They'll have to come back over and over and over. But anyone that takes of the water that I give them, the living water, they will never thirst again. Well, this made the lady kind of excited. She thought, I don't want to have to make this trip and carry all this heavy water. She said, give to me of this living water so that I won't have to come to the well anymore. And I will never be thirsty again. And Jesus said, go and get your husband. He often would answer people with something that seemed completely off base, completely irrelevant to the situation, but he had a purpose in saying this. She was focusing on the wrong thing, so he wanted to help her to understand what he was talking about. He said, go and get your husband. And she said, oh, I have no husband. And Jesus said, you have spoken true, because you have had 5 husbands. And the man that you're living with now, he is not your husband. So now we see why she's at the well all alone and the other women don't want to be with her. She's had 5 husbands and the man she's with now is not her husband. And so the woman was very surprised by this. She had never met this man before. No one she knew had ever met him before. How could he know about her, the intimate details of her life? So she said, I perceive that you are a prophet. You know things that other people couldn't possibly know. And she said, then she decided to change the subject a bit. And she's starting to understand a little bit more about the difference between the living water and the real water, or the fact that he's talking about things that don't have to do with actual factual things that you can touch. And she was probably feeling a little bad, like, how does he know this sin that I have in my heart? And so she wants to get off topic and push back. And she says, well, you Jews, you think that everyone needs to worship in Jerusalem, but we Samaritans, we worship in this mountain. This Mount Gerizim, where our ancestors worshipped. And Jesus wanted to explain to her, it's not where a person worships. That wasn't the point. It's not where a person worships. It's not whether the Jews were better or whether the Samaritans were better or anything like that. It's about how we worship. And so he said to the woman, true worshipers who worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. He says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So the woman looked at him and said, well, she was thinking, I don't really understand all this. This is above me. She says, I know that when the Messiah comes, then he will explain all things to us. And then Jesus looks at her and says something very serious. He says, I that speaketh to you am he. He told her that he was the Messiah. Now this is very unusual because in the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when people ask him if he is the Messiah, usually he talks around it. He doesn't come right out and say it, but this time he says to the Samaritan woman, he that speaketh to you am he. I am the Messiah. He didn't have much time with the Samaritans. He had to go back to Galilee and continue preaching and healing. He needed her to know straight up, right away, the truth. Well, she was so excited that when the disciples came just at that moment, right after he said that, the disciples showed up with their bread. He must have seen them coming up the hill or wherever. They showed up with the food they had gotten, thinking, oh, look, we have some food for you to eat. They're not thinking about this conversation that Jesus is having with this woman and whether it's important or not. But Jesus said the main point just before they showed up, and the woman was so excited that she left her water pot. The water didn't matter to her anymore. She left her water pot and went running back to town. Well, the disciples, they were very curious, I'm sure, to see what was going on. What was this all about? They come up and find Jesus talking with a woman. It's a little unusual because she's a Samaritan woman, and normally that wouldn't be done. But this is Jesus. But then she takes off running, and I'm sure they're very curious. What was that conversation all about? But they're used to the strange things going on, and so they just bring the food to Jesus and they say, it's time to eat. We have food. You need to eat. They know Jesus is tired. He's been walking a long way. They haven't eaten. And so they try to give him some food. And he says, no, I have food to eat that you don't know about. And they're looking at each other and they're thinking, who brought him food? Where would he get food? And then he says, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me. He's saying that this is more important than any food that he could eat. He just told the woman that her spiritual condition was more important than water. And we know that people can't go long at all without water. Maybe a couple of days without any water at all. But now he's telling the disciples that food is not important either. That doing the will of God is more important than eating food, even though he's hungry and tired. He says to the disciples, don't say there are yet. There's 4 more months until the harvest. Behold, he says to his disciples, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields because they are white, ready to harvest. Here again is a symbol. They may not have understood what he was saying right away. He is saying that people coming to God and believing in Jesus as their Savior is like bringing in the harvest. And he's saying the fields are white, ready to harvest. In other words, this town that they stopped at, where the well was, where the woman had just gone, this town was full of people ready to accept Jesus as their Savior. They just needed someone to tell them the truth so that they could believe. That was the harvest, and that was the food, not this bread that they had brought to give to him to eat. He didn't want to be distracted by earthly food, and he wanted his disciples to understand and realize this truth as well, that God's work was more important than any food they could eat, even when they were hungry. So what happened with the woman? She ran to the town, and remember, she didn't have female friends. So she ran to the town and she told all the men in the town about this man that she had seen by the well and how he said he was the Messiah. She went running around and said, come see this man who told me everything I've done. He knows my life. You need to come and see him. This is exceptional. She says, is not this the Christ? This has to be the Messiah that we've been told about all these years. He knows the things that I've done that he could never normally know. So all the men that heard this came out of the city to come and see Jesus. And Jesus taught them. And they believed when they heard him speaking with their own ears, they believed on Jesus too. So many people came to trust in Jesus. And the men were so excited to hear what Jesus had to say. They begged him to stay for 2 more days. So he spent 2 days there teaching all the people the truths of God and everlasting life. And then they said to the woman, now we believe not because of what you told us, but because we heard it with our own ears. They believed that he really was the Christ, the Savior of the world. So Jesus also wants us to remember that the living water is more important than the water that we drink. Even though that's necessary for our earthly life, living water is more important. And the living water is everlasting life, believing on Jesus as our Savior and worshiping him. And then also, he wants us to remember that doing his will is more important than the food that we would eat. And I'm sure that that seems really important when you're hungry or when chocolate cake first comes out of the oven. But we need to remember that doing the Lord's will is more important than anything like that. And that's why people fast, to remind themselves that those things are more important than the food that they eat. And Jesus asks us also to be a witness, just like he was a witness. And he told his disciples about the fields ripe unto harvest around him, which was the people ready to hear about Jesus as the Savior of the world. He wants us to tell people too, because there are fields that are ripe. There are people who are ready if they can just hear the truth. So what is a witness? A witness is someone who tells things that they have seen and know. So if God has saved you, you can tell that to people. If you've had an answer to prayer, you can tell that to people. If you learn something new in the Bible, you can tell that to people. And when you do that, then you are being a witness too. Just like the woman who went running to the town to tell all the men about the Savior that she had met. And that is the end of our lesson for today. And we will hear more next week. Have a great week. Thanks.